The Bell P-400 was never meant to be a hero. It was born from compromise, forged in the backrooms of a desperate world sliding toward war. In 1937, as Europe armed itself and the clouds of conflict darkened the Pacific, the United States Army Air Corps issued a request for something bold, a new kind of fighter that could climb faster, shoot harder, and fly higher than anything before it. Into that challenge stepped a small, ambitious company from Buffalo, New York, Bell Aircraft Corporation. Their chief designer, Robert J. Woods, believed he could rewrite the rules of air combat. His idea was radical: put the engine not in the nose, but behind the pilot's seat, driving the propeller through a long shaft that ran beneath the cockpit floor. This, he argued, would free up the nose for something terrifying: a cannon. That aircraft became the P-39 Airacobra. Still, the plane was ordered into production. War was coming, and America needed fighters, perfect or not. Bell built hundreds, then thousands. Some went to Britain and the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, others to the Pacific. The version destined for the Pacific, the P-400. Those rejected aircraft found a second life in America's hands. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States suddenly needed fighters anywhere and everywhere, no matter their shortcomings. The P-400s were crated up, shipped across the Pacific, and assigned to newly forming squadrons bound for the Solomon Islands. The pilots who received them, young men barely out of training, weren't impressed. "They're giving us the British rejects," one airman wrote in his diary. "If this is the best they've got, we're done." The mockery spread fast. Even among American crews, the P-400 earned grim nicknames: Flying Coffin, Pea Shooter with a Cannon, Bell's Blunder. The Japanese, who soon learned of its presence on Guadalcanal, laughed openly. Compared to their sleek Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, faster, lighter, more agile, the P-400 looked like a tractor with wings. Japanese pilots scoffed in the radio chatter, "The Americans send us pigs to fight eagles." But appearance deceived. The P-400 was not built for elegance, it was built for survival. Beneath its stubby frame was a core of steel. The mid-engine layout gave it balance and stability in dives. Its heavy nose cannon could cripple anything it hit, and its tricycle landing gear made it easier to handle on rough jungle airstrips than any tail-dragging Zero. It couldn't soar above the clouds, but down low, under 10,000 feet, it was steady, fast, and vicious. The same traits that made it useless over Europe made it perfect for the humid, chaotic world of the South Pacific. When the 67th Fighter Squadron received their P-400s in early 1942, they had no illusions about glory. They were stationed first in New Caledonia, training in brutal heat, their planes constantly overheating, their spare parts scarce. Many joked that the only thing the P-400 was good for was taxiing around the airfield. But in August 1942, orders came: Guadalcanal. The U.S. Marines had seized the island from the Japanese, but the enemy was already counterattacking. Whoever controlled the skies would control the island. The 67th packed up and flew to Henderson Field, a strip of crushed coral hacked out of the jungle. It was here, amid mud, mosquitoes, and constant shelling, that the P-400 would finally prove itself. The airfield was barely functional. The Japanese bombed it daily. Fuel came in drums. Mechanics worked knee-deep in puddles. The pilots slept in foxholes beside their planes, knowing that any night could bring another air raid. And their aircraft, the Flying Coffins, were the only fighters available for days at a time. "We joked about the name," recalled Lieutenant Bill Hodge, "but when that engine started and you felt that cannon rumble, you didn't feel dead, you felt mean." The Japanese were confident. From Rabaul, waves of Zeros and bombers swept toward Guadalcanal. They were certain they'd sweep the Americans off the island. They had fought P-40 Warhawks and F-45 Wildcats before, sturdy but predictable. The Airacobra was different. It stayed low, hugging the tree line, darting through the jungle mist. Japanese pilots diving from altitude suddenly found themselves in knife fight ranges where agility mattered more than climb. At 2,000 feet, the Zero's advantage vanished. On one of those mornings in mid-August, the first major clash came. A flight of P-400s from the 67th Squadron scrambled to intercept Japanese raiders approaching from the north. They climbed as high as their engines would allow, barely 8,000 feet, and waited. The Zeros appeared first, shimmering in the sunlight, circling like sharks. Then came the bombers. The Americans dove straight into them. Lieutenant Don Bell fired his 20mm cannon at point-blank range. The shell struck a Zero's fuel tank, and the plane vanished in a burst of flame. His wingman followed, hosing another with .30 caliber rounds until its wing tore off, and it spiraled into the jungle canopy below. When the surviving Japanese pilots reported back to base, they were shaken. The Americans have a new plane. It cannot climb, but it kills quickly. The laughter stopped. The men of the 67th returned to base that afternoon covered in sweat and oil, their planes pocked with holes but still flying. They had shot down 2 confirmed Zeros and driven off the bombers. A small victory, but a priceless one. For the first time, they had stood toe-to-toe with Japan's finest and survived. The flying Coffin had earned its first breath of respect. In the days that followed, the pilots painted kill marks beneath their cockpits, not out of pride, but defiance. They knew their planes weren't perfect. The cannons jammed, the engines overheated, the cockpits filled with fumes. But the P-400 had proven one truth about war. It's not always the best machine that wins, but the machine that refuses to die. The Airacobra story was no longer about failure. It was about defiance. And on the blood-red skies of Guadalcanal, that defiance was just beginning.
By the time the P-400s settled into life on Guadalcanal, every pilot who flew them knew one truth. This was not a plane built for comfort or forgiveness. It rattled when it climbed, groaned when it banked, and its Allison engine coughed like a chain smoker in the tropical heat. The men joked that the P stood for provisional. Yet, against all logic, the Airacobra began to fit the island like a glove. What Britain had dismissed as a cripple became, in the steaming jungles of the Solomons, a weapon perfectly matched to its environment. Bell Aircraft's radical design, mocked by engineers and pilots alike back home, now revealed its logic. The mid-mounted engine, which gave the plane its strange barrel-bodied shape, created a short, sturdy nose that could house not only the 20mm cannon, but also twin .50 caliber machine guns. When that cannon fired, the entire aircraft seemed to shudder with violence. The shells could rip through armor, and even a single hit on a Zero's fuel tank turned it into a fireball. Unlike nose-heavy fighters, the P-400 could sustain its aim through recoil, a trait the men of the 67 Squadron soon learned to love. Another unlikely advantage lay in its tricycle landing gear. While other fighters nosed over on muddy airstrips, the Airacobra stood tall, its nose wheel biting into the coral and clay of Henderson Field. Pilots could taxi, take off, and land on runways that looked more like farm roads. It could take off where others would dig a grave, one mechanic said dryly. And that counted, because on Guadalcanal, survival began before you ever left the ground. Still, the P-400 was no angel. Its weaknesses were as infamous as its strengths. The Allison engine's single-stage supercharger starved at high altitude. Above 12,000 feet, performance dropped like a stone. Against Japanese bombers that attacked from 20,000 feet or higher, the Americans could do little but wait for the enemy to come down to them. The British had rejected the plane precisely for that reason. But in the South Pacific, where most combat happened below the clouds, the Airacobra found its stage. The 67's pilots adapted their tactics with brutal pragmatism. They stopped trying to climb. Instead, they patrolled at treetop height, waiting to ambush raiders as they descended for their bombing runs. They flew so low that their propeller wash kicked up sheets of water from the jungle rivers. When Japanese planes tried to break off and climb, the Airacobras followed only long enough to fire a burst before diving back into the cover of the hills. The Americans began calling it jungle fighting. The Japanese flyers, used to graceful dogfights in open sky, found themselves trapped. In the maze of valleys and thunderheads around Guadalcanal, visibility was poor, Distance is deceptive, and their Zeros lost the advantage of altitude. A Zero could outturn almost anything, but only where there was room to maneuver. In narrow airspace, that agility became a curse. The P-400s, heavier but steadier, could hold a straight, firing dive longer, punch through clouds, and emerge with guns already leveled. And the firepower? That made all the difference. The P-400's 20mm cannon and 6 machine guns were devastating in a brief pass. Japanese pilots nicknamed it the Jungle Snake after several encounters where a single P-400 ambush wiped out entire bomber formations before vanishing into cloud. The Americans laughed when they heard that. "If we're dragons, then the jungle's our lair," one pilot said. Through late August and September 1942, the 67th Fighter Squadron became the unsung shield of Guadalcanal. Their missions were constant: interception at dawn, ground attack by noon, patrol at dusk. Sleep came in fragments, food in cans. When Japanese bombers pounded Henderson Field, the P-400 scrambled through craters, engines screaming, sometimes taking off while shells were still landing. They climbed as high as the clouds, then dove into the bombers with everything they had. One morning, Lieutenant Ken Buck MacArthur led 4 P-400s against 9 G-4M Betty bombers, escorted by Zeros. They came in from below, unseen, and opened fire from 300 yards. The cannon shells exploded through the bombers' bellies. One erupted into flames, another broke apart mid-air. Zeros swooped in for revenge, but MacArthur's wingman snapped off a short burst that hit one directly under the cockpit. The Japanese plane disintegrated. The Americans returned to base, low on ammo, but alive. "That Coffin," MacArthur said afterwards, patting his battered fuselage, "sure as hell kills more than it buries." Gradually, the mockery stopped, even among the Americans. What began as a hand-me-down fighter became a trusted partner. Pilots learned its quirks: how to trim the tail for tight loops, how to use the 20mm cannon sparingly to avoid jams, how to dive through a Zero formation and pull out before they could follow. Every scratch on its olive drab paint was a lesson. The shift was more than tactical, it was psychological. For the first time since the war had begun, American pilots were beating the Japanese in single combat. The flying Coffin that had been laughed off the flight line was now flying with swagger. They painted shark mouths on the noses, named their planes after girlfriends and hometowns: Daisy May, Miss Buffalo, Crazy Jane. By October 1942, the P-400 had established its own legend. It wasn't fast, it wasn't glamorous, but in the savage, low-altitude duels above the palms and rivers of Guadalcanal, it was deadly. War, as always, is the great equalizer. On paper, the P-400 shouldn't have stood a chance against the Zero. But wars aren't fought on paper. They're fought in sweat, smoke, and instinct. The men of the 67th discovered that if they stayed low, stayed fast, and trusted their guns, the flying Coffin became something else entirely: a predator. In the months ahead, it would hunt more than just aircraft. It would strafe convoys, blast jungle positions, and guard the skies that kept Guadalcanal alive. For now, though, the lesson was clear. The Coffin had opened its lid, and what had climbed out of it was vengeance with wings.
By mid-October 1942, the air above Guadalcanal had become a killing ground. Day after day, the sky filled with the rising hum of engines: Mitsubishi Zeros, Betty bombers, Dauntless dive bombers, Wildcats, and, holding the fragile middle, the Bell P-400s of the 67th Fighter Squadron. For the young American pilots, most barely 20, it was baptism by fire. They were outnumbered, outclimbed, and outgunned, at least on paper. But they had learned one thing the hard way: survival depended not on the airplane you flew, but how you fought it. The Japanese raiders came down from Rabaul, 560 miles to the north, often in waves of 20 or 30 planes. They struck Henderson Field at dawn, noon, and sunset, a relentless rhythm the men called Tojo time. Each attack meant scrambling in seconds, lifting off from a runway cratered by yesterday's bombs. Dust, mud, and exhaust filled the air. Pilots wiped their goggles with oil-stained gloves and opened throttles before the engines even warmed. It was chaos, and for the P-400, chaos was home. On October 18, 1942, a formation of 9 G-4M Betty bombers approached the island escorted by 12 Zeros. From the airstrip, 8 P-400s clawed into the sky. Among them was Lieutenant Bill Tex Harris, flying a plane patched together from 3 wrecks. His cockpit still smelled of burnt paint from a previous mission. "We saw them at maybe 9,000 feet, he recalled later. They were already setting up their bombing run, so we went up through the clouds and came at them from underneath." It was a brutal tactic. The P-400 couldn't match the Zero's climb, so it had to ambush. Harris pushed the nose down, dove hard, and leveled out behind the last bomber. His 20mm cannon thundered. The shell tore through the Japanese plane's belly. Flames erupted instantly. He pulled up just in time to avoid the debris. "One less Betty," he muttered into his radio. Another P-400 came alongside, guns blazing, and shredded a second bomber's wing. The Zeros dove in, spiraling like hornets. The Americans broke into pairs, twisting low over the jungle canopy. The air was a storm of tracers and black smoke. Harris's wingman, Lieutenant Harry White, caught a Zero on his tail. "Break left," Harris shouted. He looped behind the enemy, squeezed the trigger, and the cannon spat one round, a single perfect hit. The Zero disintegrated mid-air, scattering pieces across the trees below. When the last bomber fled north, 5 P-400s limped home. 2 were missing. Henderson's runway looked like a battlefield. It was. The ground crews waved them in, counting bullet holes. The Airacobras had claimed 5 kills. They'd also proven that even under hopeless odds, they could fight toe-to-toe with the best. Word of the fight spread quickly across the island. Marines cheered from foxholes. "Those Coffin boys, they don't die easy." The name stuck. Coffin boys. That evening, as the men sat around drinking rainwater coffee, they talked about how close they'd come. The P-400 wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. "If the Japanese think we're flying coffins, then we'll make damn sure they're the ones who end up inside." Behind the scenes, commanders noticed. The 67th Squadron's survival rate was higher than expected. Their tactics, low-altitude intercepts, cloud dives, tight turning engagements, were studied by other units. Even the Navy's F-4 Wildcat squadrons borrowed from their playbook. For the first time in the Pacific, American doctrine was evolving from improvisation to mastery. The Japanese, meanwhile, grew frustrated. Their pilots were exhausted, their replacements undertrained. They had begun calling Guadalcanal the Island of Death. 10 Ace Saburo Sakai later wrote, "The Americans no longer fought like amateurs. Their strange, heavy fighters attacked with precision and vanished into the jungle. We never knew where they would come from." Through the end of 1942, the P-400s became inseparable part of the island's defense. They escorted SBD Dauntless bombers on raids against Japanese supply ships, strafed enemy positions at the mouth of the Matanikau River, and dove on convoys attempting to land reinforcements under the cover of night. The Flying Coffin was now a hunter of ships and soldiers alike. But its greatest strength wasn't just its guns or armor, it was its pilots. Many came from rural America, farm kids who had learned to fix tractors before they ever saw an airplane. They were natural mechanics, fearless flyers, and stubborn as hell. When spare parts ran out, they scavenged from wrecks. When ammunition was short, they reloaded by hand in the rain. When the Japanese bombed Henderson, they simply filled the holes with crushed coral and flew again. In late November, the 67th helped repel a massive Japanese counterattack. For 3 days, bombers and fighters roared overhead. The P-400s rose again and again, outnumbered but undeterred. One pilot's cannon jammed mid-battle. He rammed his plane's nose into a bomber's tail to shear it apart, then bailed out into the jungle and returned 3 days later on foot. The legend grew. You can't kill a coffin that's already buried. As 1942 turned to 1943, the 67th's P-400s were worn down to their frames. Paint peeled, panels rusted, but the engine still started. They had become symbols, not of perfection, but persistence. When the newer P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts arrived months later, many veterans of the 67th watched with pride. They're the new boys now, but it was the Coffin that kept this island alive. The transformation was complete. What began as a symbol of failure had become an emblem of grit. The P-400 had proven something few machines ever could, that even the most flawed design can become deadly when matched with courage, ingenuity, and desperation. It would never win beauty contests. It would never be immortalized like the Mustang or the Corsair. But to the men who flew it, the P-400 was family. Loud, temperamental, and tough enough to bring you home when nothing else could. And for the Japanese who once mocked it, the laughter had stopped. The flying Coffin had found its resurrection.
By January 1943, the battle for Guadalcanal had turned into a war of exhaustion. Both sides had bled for every inch of jungle in Coral Strip, every hill, every coconut grove. What began as a desperate American foothold had become the decisive struggle for control of the South Pacific. The Japanese, still determined to retake the island, launched nightly bombardments and relentless air raids from Rabaul. But above it all, buzzing low through the humid skies, the P-400s of the 67th Fighter Squadron refused to die. Their aircraft were wrecks by any standard. The paint blistered from salt air, bullet holes were patched with scrap tin. One pilot joked, "Our planes are held together with prayer, tape, and mosquito guts." But those battered machines had something no replacement could replicate: experience. After 6 months of combat, every surviving pilot of the 67th had become an expert in flying the Airacobra to its limit. They knew how to nurse an overheating Allison engine, how to jink at the last second to throw off a Zero's aim, how to use cloud banks like shields. Then came the moment that would cement their legend, the Battle of the Sea Lanes. In late January, Japanese reinforcements, troop barges escorted by destroyers, attempted a daring nighttime run down the Slot, the long, narrow channel between the Solomon Islands. It was the same supply route that had kept their Guadalcanal forces alive for months, known bitterly by the Americans as the Tokyo Express. If those reinforcements made it through, the exhausted Marines on the island would face another full assault. At dawn on January 29th, spotters reported ships moving south. Henderson Field scrambled everything that could fly: Dauntless dive bombers, TBF Avengers, and the remaining P-400s of the 67th Fighter Squadron. The Airacobras, armed with 20mm cannon shells and 500-pound bombs, launched into the rising sun. For once, the weather was on their side. Thick tropical haze rolled in from the sea, cloaking their approach. Lieutenant Bill Harris, who had survived more dogfights than he could count, led the first section. They broke through the mist at 1,500 feet, directly above a Japanese destroyer formation. The gunners below opened up immediately, tracers slicing the air like orange whips. "Stay low," Harris barked over the radio. The P-400s dove to mast height, their wingtips nearly grazing the waves. At that altitude, even the Zeros couldn't follow them effectively. The first pass came fast and furious. Harris released his bomb from 300 feet. It struck near the bow of a troop transport, exploding in a geyser of flame and water. Behind him, Lieutenant Buzz Bell strafed the deck of another ship with his nose-mounted 50-caliber guns. Sailors scattered. One gun emplacement exploded. As they pulled up, the Zeros arrived, 10 of them, descending from 10,000 feet like hawks. The Airacobras, heavy and low, had nowhere to go but into the fight. They broke into pairs, twisting, rolling, diving through the smoke of burning ships. The Zeros were faster, but the Americans had learned a deadly trick: keep the fight below 3,000 feet, where the Japanese engines lost torque and their lightweight airframes struggled in the dense sea air. 1 Zero lined up on Harris's tail, closing fast. "Break right," shouted his wingman. Harris yanked the stick, rolled inverted, and kicked hard rudder, an old barnstormer's move. The Zero overshot, its silver belly flashing past. Harris squeezed the trigger. The 20mm cannon fired once, twice, and the Japanese fighter vanished in a fireball. "That's for the boys we lost," he muttered.
For nearly 40 minutes, the sky was chaos. Planes crossed within yards of each other, tracers crisscrossed like spiderwebs, and explosions from the sea below lit the undersides of the clouds. The P-400s fought like cornered wolves, outnumbered but unyielding. When it was over, 3 Japanese ships were sinking and 7 enemy aircraft had gone down. Of the 8 P-400s that launched, 5 returned, 2 damaged beyond repair, their pilots wounded but alive. It was a victory bought with sweat and blood, but it changed everything. That day, the flying Coffin became something else in the eyes of everyone on Guadalcanal. The Marines cheered as the smoke columns rose from the sea. The Navy pilots, once dismissive of the Airacobra, saluted their courage. Even the Army brass, reviewing the battle reports, acknowledged what they'd long ignored. In the hands of the 67th, the Bell P-400 had become a frontline weapon. A week later, the Japanese High Command ordered a full evacuation of Guadalcanal. The island that had devoured tens of thousands of lives was finally lost to them. As American forces secured the beaches and jungles, the P-400 pilots of the 67th stood by their battered aircraft, too tired to celebrate. They had flown their last mission of the campaign. "We were just glad it was over," Harris later said. "The Coffin had done its job, and somehow it hadn't buried us." In the months that followed, the surviving Airacobras were replaced by newer fighters, the P-38 Lightning, the F-4U Corsair, and the P-47 Thunderbolt. But the veterans of Guadalcanal carried something the new pilots couldn't learn in training: the unshakable belief that courage and adaptability mattered more than machinery. Historians would later call the P-400 an accidental success, a plane that thrived only because of its pilots' ingenuity and the peculiar demands of jungle warfare. But to the men who flew it, the truth was simpler. The Airacobra had saved lives, held the line, and given them a fighting chance when no one else could. One war correspondent wrote from Henderson Field after the battle, "They said the Airacobra couldn't climb, couldn't dogfight, couldn't win, but on Guadalcanal, it did all 3. For the Japanese, the humiliation was complete. Their aces, who once mocked the flying Coffin, now warned rookies to fear it. The short American plane with the heavy nose, one survivor recalled, kills with one shot. The irony was poetic. The very design flaws that doomed the Airacobra in Europe had turned it into a weapon of vengeance in the Pacific. And when the smoke cleared over Guadalcanal, the P-400 stood not as a failure, but as proof that even the misfit machines of war could find greatness when flown by men who refused to surrender.
When the last Japanese troops slipped away from Guadalcanal in February 1943, the battle-scarred island fell silent for the first time in 6 months. The airstrip at Henderson Field, once cratered, smoking, and haunted by the thunder of daily air raids, was now a field of ghosts. Twisted metal lay half-buried in the mud, wrecked Zeros, shattered Betty bombers, and among them the battered silhouettes of P-400 Airacobras that had somehow survived the impossible. Their green paint was scorched black, their fuselages patched with tin, but they still bore the shark-mouth grins their pilots had painted in defiance. For the men of the 67th Fighter Squadron, the war had moved on, but the legend of the flying Coffin was only beginning. Back in the United States, few civilians even knew the P-400's name. The headlines belonged to the big heroes, the B-17 Flying Fortress, the P-38 Lightning, the Marines at Guadalcanal. But among those who had fought there, among the pilots, the mechanics, and the men who watched those planes claw the sky, the Airacobra was something sacred. It wasn't glamorous, but it was loyal. It got them home. Technically, the P-400 was obsolete by the time it reached combat. Its single-stage Allison engine, designed for quick climbs at medium altitude, simply couldn't compete with the twin-supercharged monsters that came later. Above 15,000 feet, it was sluggish. Above 20,000, nearly useless. In Europe, where dogfights happened in the thin, freezing stratosphere, that was a death sentence.
But in the South Pacific, where the fight was measured in clouds, trees, and salt air, its supposed weakness became an advantage. The Airacobra's low-altitude handling was unmatched. Its heavy cannon could punch through bomber armor, and its stability made it a perfect gun platform. It could take a beating. Its mid-fuselage engine protected by layers of metal, its center of gravity allowing pilots to limp home even after half the tail was shot away. It was ugly, tough, and honest, one veteran said, just like the men who flew it. When the campaign shifted north to New Georgia and Bougainville, the surviving P-400s continued to fly in secondary roles: reconnaissance, ground attack, and patrol. They strafed Japanese barges hiding in coves, dropped small bombs on supply dumps, and provided cover for advancing infantry. By then, newer aircraft like the P-38 and F-4U were taking over the spotlight, but the Airacobra remained the workhorse of the forgotten front lines. Even as the war expanded, its influence endured. The lessons learned by the 67th, low-altitude interception, close air support, and the integration of airfields under siege became the blueprint for later Pacific air operations. The tactics honed by Coffin pilots shaped how the Army Air Forces trained replacements for the brutal, close-quarters fighting over islands like Biak, Peleliu, and Okinawa. In 1944, the P-400's cousin, the P-39 Airacobra, found a strange afterlife far from the Pacific. Under Lend-Lease, hundreds were shipped to the Soviet Union. There, Russian pilots adored it for the same reasons Americans had learned to respect it: low-altitude power, rugged construction, and a nose cannon that shredded German armor. Soviet ace Grigory Rekchalov scored dozens of kills in an Airacobra, calling it a soldier's plane, simple and deadly. What the Americans had called a coffin, the Soviets called a gift. But for the men of Guadalcanal, its legacy was personal. Each pilot carried the memory of the island's air war, the sleepless nights, the cracked runways, the smell of oil and jungle rot. They remembered how the flying coffin had pulled them out of dives, how its gunfire had lit up the dawn, and how it had kept the Japanese at bay long enough for the Marines to hold the line. "We weren't supposed to win with that thing," Lieutenant Bill Harris said years later, "but somehow we did, and that makes it ours." After the war, the P-400 quickly vanished from active service. Most were scrapped, melted down to aluminum and silence. Only a handful survived in museums or air shows, where the gleaming Mustangs and Thunderbolts drew crowds. But when veterans of the 67th Squadron gathered, they always spoke of the Airacobra with the same quiet affection. It was the underdog, and it fought like one. In 1989, during a veterans reunion, a restored P-39, the Airacobra's twin, flew over a memorial service in California. As the engine's throaty roar echoed across the field, old men in khaki caps looked up through tears. "That sound," one whispered, "that's Henderson Field." The true legacy of the P-400 wasn't its kill count or its design. It was the lesson it taught, that war rewards adaptability more than perfection. The men who flew it didn't have the best planes, but they had the courage to make the best of what they had. They turned a rejected export fighter into a weapon that defended a continent. For Japan, the lesson was even harsher. The flying coffin they had mocked became the first taste of a new kind of American war: industrial, improvised, and relentless. From the jungles of Guadalcanal to the factories of Detroit, the same spirit of ingenuity would soon unleash Hellcats, Corsairs, and B-29s. By the time Tokyo burned in 1945, the laughter that once echoed from Rabaul had long since fallen silent. Today, the few surviving P-400s sit quietly in museums, their olive-drab paint fading, their cannon muzzles empty. Visitors walk by them, pausing briefly, unaware that this ungainly machine once held the Pacific's fate in its trembling wings. But if you look closely at the chipped paint and patched panels, you can still read the story. A story of pilots who were told their plane was a death trap and made it a symbol of survival. It may have started as a joke, but it ended as a legend.